They told me that breathing the same air as Empress Vaelen was a death sentence. They said her heart was carved from the sub-zero ice of her home world, and her mercy was non-existent. In the galactic hierarchy, humans were barely a footnote, a new species with loud voices and too much hope. So when the invitation arrived for the Unity Summit, the instructions were clear. Stay in the back, keep your head down, and whatever you do, do not look the Empress in the eye. My lead attaché Marcus had paced the floor of our transport ship for 3 hours, his face pale. "Dax," he told me, "if she even senses your presence, this diplomatic mission ends in a funeral." Ours. He showed me the scans. Vaelen wasn't just royalty. She was a biological marvel of predatory grace, standing 7 feet tall with skin that shimmered like crushed obsidian. Every diplomat from 1,000 systems knew the rules. You don't speak unless spoken to. You don't move unless commanded. And you never ever sit within 10 feet of the obsidian throne. I took a deep breath, adjusting my formal suit, feeling the weight of 1 billion human lives on my shoulders. We were the underdogs, the scavengers of the stars, trying to earn a seat at a table that didn't want us. As the heavy graviton doors of the great hall groaned open, the cold hit me first, a literal frost that coated the golden pillars. The silence was absolute. Thousands of alien dignitaries stood like statues, their eyes fixed on the floor. "Hold on before we get into the real stuff, I want to know. What are you doing at this exact moment while hearing my voice? I love seeing your answers down below in the comments." I walked toward the designated low-tier seating, my boots echoing like thunderclaps in the eerie quiet. Every step felt like a gamble. I could feel the gaze of the Empress's elite guard, their plasma spears humming with a low, deadly vibration. They were looking for a reason, any reason. I found my seat at the very edge of the room, tucked away in the shadows where the lesser species were meant to rot. But then, the herald's horn sounded, a note so low it vibrated in my marrow. The Empress was entering. The air seemed to vanish from the room. She didn't walk. She glided, a vision of terrifying beauty draped in silks that looked like woven starlight. Her eyes were not solid black as the rumors suggested. They were a piercing, glowing violet that seemed to see through walls, through armor, and directly into your soul. She reached the center of the hall, where the high-ranking lords of the Inner Rim waited to bow. But she didn't stop at the throne. She didn't even acknowledge the lords who had spent trillions of credits to be near her. Instead, her head turned. Slowly, deliberately, her violet gaze swept past the generals, past the merchant kings, and locked onto the darkest corner of the room. It locked onto me. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Marcus, beside me, whispered a prayer so soft I could barely hear it. The Empress began to walk again, but she wasn't heading for her throne. She was heading toward the back of the hall, toward the human section. The entire galaxy held its breath as the most powerful being in the known universe stopped directly in front of my rickety, standard-issue chair. She leaned down, the scent of ozone and ancient spices filling my senses. The guards raised their spears. The lords gasped. And then, the Empress did the one thing no one predicted. The silence in the great hall was no longer just quiet. It was pressurized, like the hull of a ship screaming under the weight of a black hole. Empress Vaelen didn't strike. She didn't scold. Instead, she reached out a hand fingers long, tapered and tipped with obsidian-like talons, and lightly brushed the holographic display of my modest datapad. The lords of the Inner Rim looked as if they were watching the stars go out one by one. I could feel Marcus vibrating beside me, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrest of his chair. He was waiting for the execution order. I was waiting for my heart to stop. But Vaelen didn't call for the guards. Her voice, when it finally broke the silence, wasn't the screech of a predator or the cold command of a tyrant. It was a melodic hum, resonant and deep, like a cello played in a cathedral. "The humans," she whispered, her violet eyes narrowing as she studied my face. "The ones who built cities on the edge of a dying sun. The ones who refused to bow to the entropy of the void. She didn't look at Marcus. She didn't look at the high-ranking Xylosian trade barons or the warlords of the Orion Belt. She looked at me, Dax, a mid-level diplomat with a cheap suit and a dry throat. "Stand," she commanded. It wasn't a request. The gravity in the room felt like it tripled. My legs felt like lead, but I stood. I forced my spine straight, refusing to let the tremors in my hands show. I was representing Earth, and if I was going to die today, I was going to die standing. The Empress leaned in closer, so close I could see the faint, glowing neural pathways beneath her translucent skin. She was analyzing me, scanning my pulse, my pheromones, the very electrical impulses of my brain. "You were told to stay in the shadows," she said, her voice rising so the entire assembly could hear. "Your handlers told you that you were unworthy of the light of the obsidian throne." A ripple of nervous murmurs moved through the crowd. The High Vizier of the Galactic Council stepped forward, his multiple limbs twitching in agitation. "Your Majesty," he stammered, "the protocol. The human is in the outer rim seating for a reason. They are unrefined. They have not earned the right." Vaelen didn't even turn her head. She simply raised a finger, and the Vizier's voice was cut off by a shimmering stasis field that froze him mid-sentence. The message was clear. No one speaks for the Empress. She turned back to me, a faint, dangerous smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "The refined species of this galaxy have grown soft," she said, her gaze sweeping the room with blistering contempt. "They trade in shadows and speak in riddles. But I have watched your kind, Dax of Earth. I have watched you fight wars you could not win and build bridges across stars that should have burned you." She stepped back, her silk robes whispering against the frost-covered floor. Everyone expected her to return to her throne, to resume the boring, bureaucratic nightmare of the summit. Instead, she gestured to the empty space beside my seat, a space meant for luggage and discarded data shards. "This seat is unoccupied," she noted. "Your Majesty," I croaked, my voice finally returning, "that is a standard issue folding chair. It is not fit for an Empress." The room gasped again. I had spoken back. I had broken the ultimate taboo. Marcus closed his eyes, likely imagining our remains being scattered across the vacuum. The elite guards shifted, their spears glowing a violent crimson. But Vaelen didn't snap. She laughed a sound like breaking glass, and then she did something that rewrote the history of the galaxy in a single second. She sat down, not on her throne, not in the VIP section. She sat right next to me, in the dirtiest, coldest corner of the room. "The throne is a cage," she said, looking straight ahead at the stunned faces of 1,000 world leaders. "I find the company in the back much more volatile." Then she leaned toward my ear, her voice dropping to a whisper that only I could hear. "Now, Dax, tell me why your species is so obsessed with a concept as fleeting as hope. Because by the end of this night, I intend to take it from you." The temperature in the room didn't just drop, it plummeted. It wasn't the physical cold of the frost-coated pillars anymore. It was the absolute, soul-crushing chill of 1,000 powerful eyes, realizing the hierarchy had just been shattered. Empress Vaelen, the sovereign of 100 star systems, was sitting on a mass-produced carbon fiber folding chair in the unwashed section of the summit. Beside her sat I, Dax, a man whose greatest achievement until this morning was negotiating a mining lease for an asteroid belt no one wanted. Marcus was hyperventilating. I could hear his ragged breaths, and I knew if I looked at him, I'd lose my nerve. So I kept my eyes forward, staring at the empty golden obsidian throne at the far end of the hall. It looked lonely. It looked hollow. Vaelen leaned back, her obsidian skin catching the dim light of the overhead projectors, making her look like a statue brought to life. She crossed her long, elegant legs, and the sound of her silk robes was the only noise in the cavernous silence. "The High Vizier is still frozen," she remarked casually, nodding toward the stagnant official trapped in her stasis field. "He looks better that way, don't you think? Less noisy." She wasn't just talking to me. She was performing. She was showing the entire galaxy that their rules meant nothing to her. But then, she turned those violet eyes back to me, and the performance ended. You didn't answer my question, human. Hope, it's a chemical defect, isn't it? A survival mechanism for species that know they are doomed. I felt the weight of the room shifting. This wasn't just small talk. This was a trial. If I gave a standard diplomatic answer, I was dead. If I stayed silent, I was a coward. I cleared my throat, the sound rasping in the dry air. It's not a defect, Your Majesty, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. It's a bridge. We live on a planet that tries to kill us every season: floods, fires, predators. Hope is what gets us to the next morning when the math says we shouldn't make it. She tilted her head, a predatory curiosity flickering in her gaze. The math, she repeated, tasting the word. The math of this galaxy says your species should have been extinct 3 centuries ago. You expanded too fast. You fought the Krellian swarm with ships held together by prayer and duct tape. And yet, here you are, sitting next to me. She leaned in closer, her cold breath smelling like mountain air before a storm. Is it hope that makes you brave enough to look at me? Or is it just stupidity? The lords of the inner rim were beginning to recover from their shock. I saw the general of the hegemony, a massive 6-eyed creature, gripping the hilt of his ionic blade. They were insulted. The Empress was honoring a pest while they stood in the presence of an empty throne. Tension was boiling over. I could see the guards' spears shifting from defensive positions to offensive ones. One wrong move, and this room would become a slaughterhouse. Maybe a bit of both, I replied, forced a small, daring smile. But mostly, it's the curiosity. We wanted to see if the stars were as cold as they looked from the ground. Vaelen's eyes flared bright purple. For a heartbeat, I thought she was going to strike me. Her talons twitched against the armrest of her cheap chair. But then, she reached out and did something even more shocking. She tapped my datapad again, pulling up a map of Earth's solar system. Curiosity is a dangerous hunger, Dax, she whispered. And I think you've just invited a predator to dinner. Suddenly, the Great Hall's main display flickered. A red alert began to pulse across every holographic screen. A panicked voice broke over the comms. Unauthorized jump detected. Unknown fleet signature entering the high-orbit sector. Vaelen didn't look surprised. She looked bored. She looked at the screen, then back at me. It seems your hope is about to be tested sooner than you thought, she said, her voice dropping to a chilling register. The Void Eaters have arrived. And they didn't come for the Empress. They came for the humans. The air in the Great Hall didn't just grow cold, it curdled. The red pulse of the emergency lights turned Empress Vaelen's obsidian skin into a haunting shade of bruised crimson. Panic, a scent humans know all too well, began to waft from the refined species in the front rows, the Void Eaters. They weren't just another marauding fleet. They were a collective nightmare, a biological plague that stripped planets of every scrap of organic matter. And according to the scanners, they weren't targeting the capital. They were ignoring the glistening spire of the Unity Summit. They were heading straight for the Terran sector. Straight for Earth. Marcus let out a strangled gasp, his hands flying to his interface. Dax, the defense grid. It's not responding. Our lunar colonies. They're sitting ducks. His voice was a frantic staccato that cut through the low hum of the Empress's presence. I felt a cold knot tie itself in my gut. This wasn't a diplomatic incident anymore. This was an extinction event. I looked at the monitors, watching the jagged, shadow-like ships of the Void Eaters tear through the fabric of real space near our home. I turned to the Empress, my fear momentarily eclipsed by a burning, desperate fury. You knew, I whispered, the words catching in my throat. You didn't sit here because you were curious. You sat here to watch the show. To watch us burn from the best seat in the house. Vaelen didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She stayed reclined in that flimsy folding chair, her violet eyes reflecting the scrolling casualty projections on my datapad. I am an Empress, Dax. I do not watch shows. I orchestrate them. She reached out, her sharp talon tracing the line of the Void Eater's trajectory. The Council has already voted in secret. To save the Inner Rim, they have agreed to let the Void Eaters feast on the expendable outer systems. They've traded your son for their safety. A roar of protest erupted from the front of the hall. The general of the hegemony stepped forward. His 6 eyes narrowed in a look of supreme arrogance. "It is the only logical path," he shouted, his voice amplified by his suit speakers. "The humans are a drop in the ocean. Why risk a galactic war for a species that hasn't even mastered full space physics?" I stood up, the chair clattering loudly against the floor. I didn't care about the spears. I didn't care about the stasis fields, because we're the ones who fought for you. I screamed, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. When the Krillian swarm hit your borders, it wasn't the hegemony that held the line. It was human volunteers in rusted freighters. The room went deathly still. The truth was a bitter pill, and the elite didn't like the taste of it. I turned back to Vaelen, my heart pounding a rhythm of pure defiance. "If this is why you sat next to me, to see if hope breaks, then look closely. Because we're not going out without a fight." Vaelen stood up slowly, her height looming over me once again. She looked at the general, then at the frozen High Vizier, and finally back at me. A strange, shimmering light began to emanate from her skin, a bioluminescence that signaled her true power was waking up. "The Council has made their choice," she said, her voice dropping to a low, predatory growl that made the floor tiles vibrate. "But I have not made mine." She turned toward her elite guard, her violet eyes burning like dying stars. "Prepare my personal dreadnought," she commanded. The general gasped. "Your Majesty, you cannot interfere." The treaty was written on paper," Vaelen snapped, her voice cutting through his protest like a blade. "I am written in blood." She turned to me, a terrifying, beautiful smile stretching across her face. "Dax of Earth, you said hope is a bridge. Let's see if it can support the weight of my empire." She grabbed my arm, her grip like cold iron, and began to pull me toward the exit. But as we reached the doors, the main screen flickered again. The Void Eater fleet hadn't just reached Earth's orbit. They had deployed a Sun Eater device. The countdown to our star's collapse had begun. Vaelen looked at the timer, 12 minutes, and then at me. "We can't make it in time," she whispered, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something that looked almost like regret in her eyes. Unless what?" I demanded, my voice cracking under the weight of the ticking clock on the screen. 12 minutes. Earth had survived ice ages, cataclysms, and world wars, only to be erased in the time it takes to grab a cup of coffee. Marcus was already on his knees, staring at the floor, the realization of total loss finally breaking him. But Vaelen wasn't looking at the screen anymore. She was looking at the Great Hall's central spire, a massive crystalline antenna designed for galactic communication. "The Unity Spire," she whispered, her violet eyes narrowing. "It's not just a transmitter, Dax. It's a focal point for the planetary shield. If we can invert the polarity of the spire's resonance chamber, we can create a localized fold space tunnel. A bridge, as you call it." She turned to me, her grip tightening on my shoulder. "But the energy required to tear a hole in space that large, it won't come from a battery. It has to come from the core of this station. And once that bridge opens, this entire summit becomes ground zero." The general of the hegemony overheard. He scrambled backward, his 6 eyes wide with terror. "You're insane. You'll kill us all to save a primitive rock?" He lunged for his comms unit, likely to signal his fleet to evacuate, but Vaelen didn't even look at him. With a flick of her wrist, a pulse of dark energy sent his device skittering across the floor. "I am the Empress," she said, her voice dropping into a register that made the very air vibrate. "And I have grown tired of your logical cowardice." She turned back to me, the urgency in her gaze sharp enough to draw blood. "Dax, I can open the door. But my people cannot pilot through a fold space tunnel that's unstable. Our ships are too large, too rigid. We need something smaller, something reckless." I knew exactly what she was asking. The human diplomatic shuttle was docked in Bay 9, It was a stripped-down, high-velocity scout ship, built for speed and maneuverability. It was basically an engine with a cockpit attached. It was the only thing fast enough to dive through a collapsing wormhole and deliver a payload. "We have a prototype fusion core in the shuttle," I said, the plan forming in my mind with terrifying clarity. "If we can get it to Earth's sun before the Sun Eater stabilizes, we can disrupt the collapse. But Marcus is in no state to fly, and I'm just a diplomat." Vaelen's smile returned, sharp, cold, and strangely encouraging. "You told me hope was a bridge, human. I'm providing the stones. Are you going to walk across?" She didn't wait for an answer. She began to run, her silk robes flowing behind her like a shadow, pulling me through the panicked crowds of aliens who were now screaming and trampling each other to reach the escape pods. We burst into the docking bay, the smell of burnt fuel and ozone filling the air. My shuttle sat there, looking like a piece of junk compared to the sleek obsidian cruisers of the Empress's fleet, but it was our junk. "Get in," Vaelen commanded. "Wait," I said, stopping at the ramp. "What about you? You said this station becomes ground zero. If you stay to hold the bridge open, you'll be right in the middle of the explosion when the fold collapses." The Empress of 100 Systems looked at the humble human shuttle, then back at the crumbling grandeur of the Unity Summit. For the first time, I didn't see a predator. I saw someone who was finally free. "They said don't go near her," she mused, echoing the warnings my people had lived by. Perhaps they were right. "I am a very dangerous person to know, Dax." She shoved me into the cockpit and slammed the seal. Through the reinforced glass, I saw her sprint toward the Spire's control console. The station began to groan, a deep, metallic scream that signaled the core was being pushed past its limits. The countdown hit 8 minutes. Suddenly, the space in front of my shuttle began to warp. The stars twisted into a violent swirling vortex of purple and white light. It was beautiful. It was lethal. And then, over the shuttle's comms, I heard her voice one last time, whispered directly into my headset. "Don't let me down, Dax. Show them what a human can do when he's fueled by nothing but defects." I slammed the thrusters to maximum. The G-force pinned me to my seat, blurring my vision. I felt the shuttle groan as it hit the event horizon of the Fold space tunnel. But just as I entered the vortex, a massive shadow appeared on my long-range sensors. One of the Void Eater's Reaper-class ships had detected the rift. It wasn't waiting for me at Earth. It was coming through the tunnel from the other side. The tunnel wasn't a vacuum. It was a screaming kaleidoscope of raw energy and folded dimensions. My shuttle, the Icarus, groaned as the hull integrity dropped to 70% within seconds. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was the Reaper. A Void Eater vessel the size of a small moon was currently clogging the only highway back to Earth. It looked like a jagged tooth made of obsidian and Nalus, and it was charging its primary beam. If it fired inside the Fold space tunnel, the resulting explosion wouldn't just kill me, it would collapse the bridge Vaelen was holding open, taking her and the entire Unity Summit with it. "Not today," I growled, my hands dancing over the manual overrides. I didn't have shields. I didn't have torpedoes. What I had was a prototype fusion engine and a death wish fueled by adrenaline. I pushed the throttle past the red line. The Icarus screamed, a metallic wail that vibrated through my teeth. I wasn't going to fly around the Reaper. There was no around in a 5-mile-wide wormhole. I was going to fly through it. On my HUD, a small flickering icon appeared. It was a transmission from the station. Not from the Empress, but from Marcus. He had finally snapped out of his shock. "Dax, if you hit their venting port at this velocity, the kinetic energy alone will trigger a chain reaction. But you have to be precise. If you miss by an inch, you're just a bug on a windshield." "I've got this, Marcus. Tell the Empress to hold that door open. Don't let it flicker," the Reaper fired. A beam of pure antimatter sliced through the vortex, missing my cockpit by less than a meter. The heat flash blinded me for a second, the smell of melting plastic filling the cabin. My vision cleared just in time to see the gaping maw of the Reaper's docking bay. It was a dark, ribbed throat of machinery. I tucked the shuttle's wings in, pulled the nose up, and prayed to every god humanity had ever invented. The impact was silent. In the vacuum-compressed air of the fold, the sound couldn't travel. There was only a violent jar that nearly snapped my neck, followed by the sight of the Reaper's internal corridors blurring past me at Mach 5. I was inside the beast. Debris from my own hull was trailing behind me like metallic confetti. I saw the Void Eater drones, spidery horrific things, scrambling to intercept, but I was moving too fast for their sensors to lock on. Then the world turned white. The fusion core at the heart of the Icarus began to bleed radiation. The defect of human engineering, our tendency to overclock everything, was finally paying off. I wasn't just a pilot anymore. I was a bullet. I punched through the far side of the Reaper's engine block just as the entire ship began to fold in on itself, consumed by the very rift it was trying to block. I burst out of the other side of the tunnel, and for a moment, the screaming stopped. The stars were familiar. The blue marble of Earth was right there, hanging in the dark, beautiful, and fragile. But the Sun Eater was already latched onto our star, a parasitic machine draining the life fire of humanity's home. The countdown on my dash read, 2 o'clock. Dax to Earth command. Do you read me? Silence. The interference from the Sun Eater was total. I looked at the fusion payload in my cargo hold. To stop the collapse, I didn't just need to drop the bomb. I had to deliver it into the heart of the machine. And the machine was guarded by a swarm of Void Eater interceptors that had just spotted my lone, battered shuttle. My comms crackled. It wasn't Earth. It was a cold, melodic hum. "You're late, Dax," Vaelen's voice whispered, sounding strained, as if she were lifting a mountain. "I can't hold the bridge much longer. The station is tearing apart. Hold on, Vaelen, I'm almost there." "Don't look back," she commanded. "Look at the sun. Be the hope you bragged about." Suddenly my sensors flared. A second rift was opening right behind me. But it wasn't a Void Eater ship. It was a single obsidian black fighter, sleek and terrifying. The Empress's personal guard? No. The ship's transponder ID read, the Sovereign's Shadow. She hadn't just stayed behind to hold the door. She had sent her best. But as the fighter began to engage the interceptors, I realized the pilot wasn't an alien. The flight patterns? They were erratic, aggressive, and completely insane. They were human. The cockpit of the Sovereign's Shadow flickered onto my secondary screen, and my jaw hit the floor. It wasn't an alien at the stick. It was Marcus. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes, his face covered in soot and his eyes wide with a manic, terrified energy. The Empress. "She didn't just give me her ship, Dax," Marcus yelled over the roar of the engines. "She gave me her neural link. I can see through the ship's eyes. I can feel the vacuum." Vaelen had done the unthinkable. She had shared her private, royal technology with a lesser species to give us a fighting chance. Marcus was flying that obsidian interceptor like a man possessed, weaving through the Void Eater swarm and turning their ships into scrap metal with bursts of violet plasma. "Go, Dax, I'll clear the path. Get that payload into the Sun Eater's throat." I didn't waste a second. I dove. The Sun Eater machine was a colossal, ringed structure surrounding our sun, humming with a sickly green light as it siphoned the star's energy. Gravity wells were tugging at the Icarus, trying to tear the wings off my battered shuttle. The heat was becoming unbearable. The temperature in my cockpit rose to 45 degrees Celsius, then 50 degrees Celsius. My skin was slick with sweat, and the controls were almost too hot to touch. 1 minute. I shouted, though there was no one left to hear me but the ghosts of the transmission. I saw the primary intake port a glowing aperture at the center of the machine. It looked like the eye of a god. If I could just get the fusion core inside that opening, the feedback loop would shatter the Sun Eater's containment field. But then, a shadow fell over me. A Void Eater executioner ship, a massive wall of spikes and cannons, moved to block the port. It didn't fire. It didn't need to. It was just going to ram me. I pulled the stick back, but my thrusters sputtered. The Icarus was dying. I was drifting, a few kilometers away from the target, watched by the cold, unfeeling sensors of a machine that had consumed 1,000 worlds. "I'm stuck," I whispered, the heat making my head swim. "I can't clear the executioner." Suddenly, the comms erupted in a surge of static and a sound I'll never forget. Vaelen's laughter. It wasn't a laugh of joy. It was a laugh of absolute, divine fury. Did you think I would let a machine finish what I started? Back at the Unity Summit, thousands of light years away, the Empress had done something suicidal. She hadn't just held the bridge, she had overloaded it. She used the station's own core as a projectile. On my sensors, I watched as the fold space tunnel didn't just stay open. It expanded, reaching out like a hungry hand. A massive white-hot beam of pure energy erupted from the rift behind me. It wasn't a weapon. It was the literal remains of the Unity Summit station, compressed into a spear of light. It struck the executioner's ship with the force of a collapsing moon, vaporizing it instantly. The path to the Sun Eater was clear. "Now, Dax." Vaelen's voice was fading, becoming a ghostly echo in the static. "For Earth, for the bridge." I didn't think. I didn't feel the heat. I slammed the manual eject on the fusion core. The payload shot forward, propelled by my shuttle's last remaining emergency thrusters. I watched it glide, a tiny silver speck against the backdrop of a dying sun. It entered the aperture. The world didn't explode. It went silent. For 3 long, agonizing seconds, the Sun Eater just stopped. And then, a ripple of blue fire began to tear through the rings. The silence was the most terrifying part. For 3 seconds, the universe seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if humanity's hope was enough to rewrite the laws of physics. Then, the blue fire didn't just ripple, it screamed. The Sun Eater's rings, those massive world-choking bands of alien machinery, began to buckle and twist. The green energy they had stolen from our sun turned a violent, purest white. The feedback loop was working. The machine was choking on the very power it tried to consume. A shockwave of pure kinetic energy slammed into the Icarus. I was tossed around the cockpit like a ragdoll, the straps of my seat digging into my shoulders until I heard my own ribs groan. Outside, the Sun Eater was disintegrating. It looked like a crown of thorns being shattered by a hammer of light. Great shards of obsidian and glowing circuitry, some the size of cities, were flung into the void. "Dax, get out of there!" Marcus's voice broke through the roar of my venting oxygen. On my screen, I saw the Sovereign's shadow diving through the debris field, its violet thrusters leaving a trail of defiance against the blackness. "The sun is stabilizing, but the explosion is creating a gravity well. If you don't move now, you're going down with the wreckage." I grabbed the controls, but they were dead. The Icarus was a hollow shell. No power, no life support. Just a man in a tin can falling toward a star that was finally finding its balance again. I watched the Sun Eater's central core collapse into a miniature singularity, pulling everything nearby into its hungry maw. I was less than 5 kilometers away. "I can't, Marcus," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. I looked out the window at Earth. The blue marble was still there. The atmospheric fires were fading. We had won. The engines are fried. Just tell them it worked. Tell Earth we aren't a footnote anymore. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. But the end didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange, humming vibration, the same frequency I had felt in the Great Hall when the Empress first sat beside me. My eyes snapped open. The Icarus wasn't falling anymore. It was being held in a shimmering violet stasis field. I looked to my left. A massive obsidian dreadnought, the Empress's flagship, had emerged from the collapsing rift. It was scorched, its hull scarred by the energies of the fold, but it was beautiful. And right there, on the bridge's forward view screen, I saw a familiar silhouette. Empress Vaelen was standing at the helm, her robes tattered, her obsidian skin glowing with a faint, exhausted light. She didn't use the comms. She didn't need to. Her voice echoed directly in my mind, a telepathic bridge that felt like silken steel. You didn't think I'd let my favorite folding chair go to waste, did you, Dax? The Dreadnought's tractor beams locked on, pulling my shattered shuttle into its massive docking bay. As the airlock hissed and the pressure equalized, I slumped forward, the adrenaline finally leaving my system. We had survived. But as I stepped out of the shuttle and onto the deck of the alien warship, I saw the faces of the Empress's crew. They weren't celebrating. They were looking at their sensors with expressions of pure horror. I looked at the main display. The Void Eater fleet wasn't retreating, they were regrouping. And they weren't alone. The hegemony and the other refined species had arrived, but they weren't here to help. Their weapons were locked not on the Void Eaters, but on us. The High Vizier's voice crackled over the ship's speakers, cold and final. Empress Vaelen, you have violated the Galactic Accord. You have weaponized a diplomatic station and shared forbidden tech with a Tier 3 species. By order of the Council, you and the humans are hereby declared enemies of the galaxy. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. We had just saved the sun, prevented the extinction of 1 billion souls, and stopped a biological plague from consuming the sector, and for our reward, the galaxy had branded us criminals. I stood on the bridge of the Empress's flagship, my legs shaking as I watched the holographic tactical map. We were surrounded. On one side, the ragged but still lethal remnants of the Void Eater swarm. On the other, the pristine gold-plated warships of the Galactic Council. The High Vizier's image appeared on the main screen. He was no longer frozen in stasis, and his arrogance had returned tenfold. The human miracle is a breach of universal law, he sneered. Empress Vaelen, you have tipped the scales of power. We cannot allow a species as volatile as the humans to possess the secrets of the Obsidian Throne. Surrender the human Dax and stand down your fleet, or be erased along with them. I looked at Vaelen. She stood at the center of the bridge, her tall frame silhouetted against the fire of our sun. She looked exhausted, her violet eyes dimmed to a faint glow, but her spine was as straight as a blade. She didn't look like a defeated queen. She looked like a predator that had just realized the cage was finally open. They fear us, Dax, she whispered, her voice carrying across the bridge. Not because we are evil, but because we are unpredictable. They spent eons building a galaxy of rules, and in one afternoon, a human and a monster tore it all down. She turned to her helm officer, a being with skin like liquid mercury. Charge the resonance cannons. All of them. Your Majesty, the officer hesitated. We are at 20% power. If we engage the Council fleet, we won't have enough energy to maintain life support. Vaelen turned her gaze back to the High Vizier on the screen. A slow, terrifying smile spread across her face, the same smile she had given me in the back of the Great Hall. Then we won't use our power, she said. She looked at me, a silent question in her eyes. Dax, your people have a saying, something about all in? Going all in, I replied, a surge of defiant energy sparking in my chest. I turned to the comms console. Marcus, are you still in that fighter? I'm here, Dax. Marcus's voice crackled, sounding more human and more determined than ever. And I'm not the only one. Look at the long-range sensors. I looked. Emerging from the shadow of Earth's moon wasn't a fleet of high-tech warships. It was a swarm of thousands. Tens of thousands. Mining haulers, transport freighters, old atmospheric scouts, and even private yachts. Every human ship within 3 light hours had answered the call. They weren't armed with plasma cannons or stasis fields. They were armed with mining lasers, welding torches, and the sheer, stubborn will to protect their own. The Council thinks they are the galaxy, I told the High Vizier, my voice booming through the transmission. But they forgot who does the work, who mines the ore, who builds the stations. You've declared war on the humans? Fine, but you're not just fighting a fleet. You're fighting the very blood and bone of your own empire. The High Vizier's face paled. He looked at the sea of lesser ships closing in. They were outmatched, outgunned, and technologically primitive. But there were too many of them to kill before they reached the council lines. Vaelen stepped forward, her hand resting on the command console. "This is the moment, Dax. The moment where hope becomes a weapon." She raised her voice, broadcasting to every ship in the vicinity, council, human, and Void Eater alike. "This is Empress Vaelen. To the council, fire one shot, and I will leak the blueprints of every piece of your forbidden tech to every corner of the black market. To the Void Eaters, leave now or be the first to test a human's fury." The tension was a physical weight. I watched the council general's finger hover over the firing stud. One click, and the stars would bleed. But then, something shifted. The council general's finger didn't move. It couldn't. Behind him on his own bridge, his crew beings from a dozen different low-tier systems had stopped their work. They weren't looking at their consoles. They were looking at the screen, at the human fleet that had risen from the ashes of a near apocalypse. The mutiny was silent but total. The High Vizier looked around his command deck, realizing that the fear he had used to rule for centuries had finally evaporated. "The summit is over," Vaelen declared, her voice echoing like a tolling bell across the vacuum. "The era of the elite has burned away in the light of the Terran sun." The council ships began to break formation. One by one, they turned their bows away from Earth, jumping into hyperspace without a single shot fired. They weren't retreating to regroup. They were retreating to survive the political firestorm that was about to consume their own worlds. The Void Eaters, sensing the shift in the predatory hierarchy, scattered like shadows when a light is struck. The Great Hall was gone, the Unity Summit was space dust. But as I stood on the bridge of the Empress's flagship, looking at the thousands of human ships surrounding us like a protective shroud, I realized something. We hadn't just saved a planet. We had claimed our seat. Vaelen turned to me. The violet glow in her eyes had softened into something almost warm, a flicker of the glacial cliff face finally melting. "They told you not to approach me, Dax," she said, her voice a low, melodic hum. "And yet, you are the only one left standing by my side." "I guess I've always had a problem with following directions," I admitted, my chest tightening with an emotion I couldn't quite name. She looked out at the stars, her obsidian skin reflecting the rebirth of the sun. "The galaxy will be different now, messy, dangerous, filled with hope." She glanced at me, a playful, lethal spark returning to her gaze. "I think I might stay for a while. This Earth of yours. I want to see the cities you built on the edge of the fire." I looked at the screen, where Marcus was performing a victory roll in the Sovereign's shadow, and where 1 billion people were waking up to a sun that still shone. "You're welcome anytime, Your Majesty. But just so you know, our chairs aren't much better on the surface." She laughed, and this time, it was a sound of genuine, terrifying joy. We weren't just a footnote anymore. We were the authors of the next chapter. That was the day the galaxy learned that if you push a human to the edge, we won't just fall. We'll build a bridge out of the wreckage and invite a queen to walk it with us. If you enjoyed this journey through the stars and the sheer defiance of the human spirit, make sure to hit that like button and share this video with your fellow star travelers. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more cinematic tales of human grit and galactic wonder, subscribe to HFY Soundscape and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what happens when the lighter species finally take charge. Until next time, keep looking at the stars and never let anyone tell you where you're allowed to sit.